Our discussion for today is about the Fourth Republic, which is the martial law period, the declaration of martial law, and the end of military rule. Martial law involves the temporary substitution of military authority for civilian rule and is usually invoked in time of war, rebellion, and natural disaster. When martial law is in effect, the military commander of an area or country has unlimited authority to make and enforce laws. President Ferdinand E. Marcos signed the Proclamation No. 1081 on September 21, 1972, placing the Philippines under martial law. Some sources say that Marcos signed the proclamation on September 17 or on September 22, but in either case, the document itself was dated September 21. Throughout the martial law period, Marcos built up the cult of September 21, proclaiming it as National Thanksgiving Day by virtue of Proclamation No. 1180, series of 1973, to memorialize the date as the foundation day of his new society. The propaganda effort was so successful that up to the present, many Filipinos, particularly those who did not live through the events of September 23, 1972, labor under the misapprehension that martial law was proclaimed on September 21, 1972. It was not. The culmination of a long period of preparation. A week before the actual declaration of martial law, a number of people had already received information that Marcos had drawn up a plan to completely take over the government and gain absolute rule. Senator Benigno S. Aquino Jr., during a September 13, 1972 privilege speech, exposed what was known as o Plan Sagittarius. The senator said he had received a top-secret military plan given by Marcos himself to place Metro Manila and outlying areas under the control of the Philippine Constabulary as a prelude to martial law. Marcos was going to use a series of bombings in Metro Manila, including the 1971 Plaza Miranda bombing, as a justification for his takeover and subsequent authoritarian rule. This was indeed the culmination of a long period of preparation. As early as May 17, 1969, Marcos hinted the declaration of martial law when he addressed the Philippine Military Academy Alumni Association that one of his favorite mental exercise, which others may find useful, is to foresee possible problems one may have to face in the future and to determine what solutions can possibly be made to meet these problems. The same thing is true with the declaration of martial law. It is a useful mental exercise to meet a problem before it happens. In his memoir, then Justice Secretary Juan Ponce Enrile recalled that on the late afternoon in December 1969, Marcos instructed him to study the powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief under the provisions of the 1935 Constitution. Marcos made this instruction as he foresaw an escalation of violence and disorder in the country, and wanted to know the extent of his powers as Commander-in-Chief. The President also stressed that the study must be done discreetly and confidentially. At about the same time, Marcos also instructed Executive Secretary Alejandro Melchor and Jose Almonte to study how martial law was implemented in different parts of the world. Marcos also wanted to know the consequences of declaring martial law. The result of their study stated that while martial law may accelerate development, in the end, the Philippines would become a political archipelago with debilitating factionalized politics. Almonte recalled that their findings led to the conclusion that the nation would be destroyed because, apart from the divisiveness it would cause, martial law would offer Marcos absolute power which would corrupt absolutely. By the end of January 1970, Enrile, with the help of Efren Plana and Minerva Gonzaga Reyes, submitted only the copy of the confidential report on the legal nature and extent of martial law to Marcos. A week later, Marcos summoned Enrile and instructed him to prepare the documents to implement martial law in the Philippines. In his January 1971 diary entries, Marcos discussed how he met with business leaders, intellectuals from the University of the Philippines, and the military to lay the groundwork that extreme measures would be needed in the future. On May 8, 1972, Marcos confided in his diary that he had instructed the military to update its plans, including the list of personalities to be arrested, and had met with Enrile to finalize the legal paperwork required. On August 1, 1972, Marcos met with Enrile and a few of his most trusted military commanders to discuss tentative dates for the declaration of martial law to fall within the next 2 months. All of the dates they considered either ended in 7 or were divisible by 7, as Marcos considered 7 his lucky number. On September 21, 1972, democracy was still functioning in the Philippines. Senator Benigno Aquino Jr. was still able to deliver a privileged speech, what would be his final one, in the Senate. Primitivo Mijares, among others, recounted the functioning of the House of Representatives and the Senate with the committee meetings scheduled for that night. Senate and House leaders agreed not to adjourn on this day as earlier scheduled. They decided to extend their special session to a sine-die adjournment on September 23. That afternoon, a protest march in Plaza Miranda was sponsored by the Concerned Christians for Civil Liberties. The rally was attended by more than 30 civic, religious, labor, students, and activist groups, and a crowd of 30,000 received coverage from newspapers, radio, and television. In his diary, Marcos wrote that he, together with his members of his cabinet and staff, finished the preparation of Proclamation 1081 at 8 p.m. September 21. On September 22, 1972, a day after the final speech of Ninoy Aquino, newspapers still came out. They featured the rally held the previous day in Plaza Miranda. Mijares recounted that Marcos was agitated by a statement reported in the Daily Express that if martial law were declared, Aquino said he would have to be arrested soon after he would escape to join the resistance. The Enrile ambush as pretext for martial law. The pretext for martial law was provided later in the evening of Friday, September 22, 1972. The convoy of Secretary of Defense Juan Ponce Enrile was ambushed in Wakwak as he was on his way home to Dasmariñas village in Makati before 9 p.m. Enrile recalled his convoy was driving out of Camp Aguinaldo when a car opened fire at his convoy and sped away. This ambush, as Enrile later revealed in 1986, was staged by Marcos to justify martial law. When Marcos appeared on a television at 7:15 p.m. on September 23, 1972 to announce that he had placed the entire Philippines under martial law, by virtue of Proclamation No. 1081, he framed his announcement in the legalistic terms that were untrue. This helped camouflage the true nature of his act to this day. It was nothing less than a self-coup. Marcos announced that he had placed the entire country under martial law as of 9 p.m. on September 22, 1972 via a proclamation which he claimed he'd signed on September 21, 1972. Two things emerged. First, whether they conflict or not, all accounts indicate that Marcos' obsession with the numerology necessitated that Proclamation No. 1081 would officially be signed on a date that was divisible by 7. Thus, September 21, 1972 became the official date that martial law was established at the day that Marcos' dictatorship began. This allowed Marcos to control history on his own terms. Day 1 of the Marcos dictatorship. The second is that the arbitrary date emphasizes that the actual date for martial law was not the numerologically auspicious for Marcos 21st, but rather the moment that martial law was put into full effect, which was after the nationwide address of Ferdinand Marcos as far as the nation was concerned, September 23, 1972. By then, personalities considered threats to Marcos, Senators Benigno S. Aquino Jr., Jose Diokno, Francisco Rodrigo, and Ramon Mitra Jr., and members of the media such as Joaquin Roses, Teodoro Locsin Sr., Maximo Sullivan, and Amando Doronila had already been rounded up, starting with the arrest of Senator Aquino at midnight on September 22, and going into the early morning hours of September 23, when 100 of the 400 personalities targeted for arrest were already detained in Camp Crame by 4 a.m. In the meantime, the military had shut down mass media, flights were cancelled, and incoming overseas calls were prohibited. Press Secretary Francisco Tatad went on air at 3 p.m. of September 23 to read the text of Proclamation number 1081. The readings of the proclamation was followed by Marcos going on air at 7:15 p.m. to justify the massive clampdown of democratic institutions in the country. Marcos would subsequently issue General Order number 1, series of 1972, transferring all powers to the President, who was to rule by decree. After the declaration and imposition of martial law, citizens would still go on to challenge the constitutionality of Proclamation number 1081. Those arrested filed petitions for habeas corpus with the Supreme Court, but Marcos, who had originally announced that martial law would not supersede the 1935 Constitution, engineered the replacement of the Constitution with a new one. On March 31, 1973, the Supreme Court issued the final decision in Javillana v. Executive Secretary, which essentially validated the 1973 Constitution. This would be the final legitimizing decision on the constitutionality of martial law. The Supreme Court dismissed petitions for habeas corpus by ruling that martial law was a political question beyond the jurisdiction of the court, and that furthermore the court had already deemed 1973 Constitution in full force and effect, replacing the 1935 Constitution. He ruled under martial law from 1972 until 1981 and kept most of his martial law powers until he was deposed in 1986, branding his rule as constitutional authoritarianism under his Kilusang Bagong Lipunan, or the New Society movement. In 1981, Marcos officially lifted martial law, but since all decrees issued during that time were still in force, the lifting was merely a symbolic gesture. In the June presidential elections of that year, he ran under the KBL, his main opponent being nationalist Alejo Santos. Factors that led to the fall of the dictatorship. Reformist Opposition. The Reformist Opposition, also known as the Legal Opposition, was composed of members of the upper middle class. Using non-violent tactics, they advocated political reforms. However, the Reformist Opposition was not a united movement, but an amalgamation of different middle and upper class groups who had different motives. It was for this reason that Marcos tolerated them, so long as they were incapable of viably replacing him or attaining the support of the masses. Another is the Revolutionary Opposition. The government's use of communist and secessionist threats as justification for martial law only contributed to the growth of the political opposition and the amassing of recruits to the new People's Army and the Moro National Liberation Front in the provinces in the 1970s. When martial law was declared, the Moro National Liberation Front, or the MNLF, was immediately mobilized. Formed by students and politicians from Mindanao, its goal was to create the Bangsa Moro Republic, or the Moro National Republic, composed of Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan. The armed forces of the Philippines attempted to seize their illegal firearms supplied by Libya, sparkling a war that lasted from 1973 to 1977. Religious Opposition. Martial law also faced opposition from the religious sector. Mainline Protestant churches have been vocal in their opposition of the dictatorship since 1972. By 1978, they were holding mass protest actions, and by 1981, they held boycott campaigns for the April plebiscite and the June presidential elections. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church, which sympathized with Marcos' anti-communism, maintained a position of critical collaboration while paying attention to the opposition among its members. This allowed it a degree of autonomy when it came to carrying out their social projects, which focused on alleviating poverty and defending the poor against communism. However, the provincial clergy started becoming radicalized after seeing the effects of Marcos' dictatorships on the poor. They formed Christians for National Liberation, which clandestinely used church social action programs to get foreign funding through private donor agencies that shared the same views. On January 17, 1981, in an effort to calm the growing opposition of the Catholic Church, President Marcos lifted martial law via Proclamation number 2045 in preparation for the state visit of Saint Pope John Paul II on February 17, 1981. In the events leading to the important state visit, The Coconut Palace was commissioned by First Lady Imelda Marcos to be built at the cost of 37 million as a guest house of the Pope. However, the pontiff refused, saying it was too ostentatious given the state of the poor in the country. Moreover, during his visit in Malacañang Palace, the Pope delivered a speech explicitly condemning the human rights violations committed under the regime. Since then, the Catholic Church had withdrawn its support of the Marcos administration. Marcos' health and the issue of succession. As early as 1979, the health of President Marcos had been deteriorating. This was kept a secret at first, but it was common knowledge then that Marcos was already sick, especially at the time of the assassination of Ninoy Aquino. Marcos' failing health, coupled with the looming threat from the anti-capitalist left, led to the widespread concern for a stable succession among the country's economic elite, the main beneficiaries of the martial law's crony capitalism. The collapse of the Philippine economy. In the last years of the Marcos regime, the Philippine economy was almost grinding to a halt. This was so despite the fact that the Marcos administration implemented its three-pronged development strategy, which is the Green Revolution in agriculture, growth in diversity in agricultural and forestry exports, and massive external borrowing. The profit from these three strategies were amassed disproportionately to the wealthiest in the population, thereby causing a large disparity between the rich and the poor. In the case of agriculture, the higher rice yields saved land for export crops and saved foreign exchange for non-rice imports, but these gains never trickled down to the poor. In addition, there were government intervention, cronyism, and monopolization of agricultural markets such as that of sugar and coconut. In these cases, key government agencies were managed by Marcos associates and cronies whose operations were not audited. In the case of foreign loans, the primary pretext was for the Philippine domestic investment and building public infrastructure. However, these loans were diverted for a few private companies, all of which were under Marcos cronies, eroding the quality and quantity of domestic investments. The rest were diverted to banks abroad. An example of striking evidence of this was the Bataan nuclear power plant, which was built at the cost of $1.2 billion but never generated kilowatt of electricity under the Marcos regime. The assassination of Ninoy Aquino. After 3 years of exile in the United States, Ninoy Aquino Jr., the foremost leader of the Marcos opposition, decided to come back to the Philippines, intending to restore democracy in the country and convinced President Marcos for an orderly succession. Despite news of a death threat, Ninoy maintained in an interview on August 21, 1983 that if it's fate to die by an assassin's bullet, then so be it. To suffer with our people and to lead them. Aquino landed in the Manila International Airport via China Airlines Flight 811 at 1:05 p.m. on August 21 and was escorted by armed men out of the plane. Minutes later, gunshots were heard. The former senator was shot dead by an assassin's bullet to the head. When the news of Ninoy's death spread, approximately 7 million came to his funeral procession on August 31, the biggest and longest in Philippine history. This singular event further eroded the people's support of the Marcos regime. The failure of the snap election in 1986. The announcement for a snap election within 3 months was ahead of schedule. The next regular elections were supposed to be held in 1987. The president was overconfident. He disregarded the objections of his family, his cabinet, and his party. Marcos had to consolidate his forces if the election would go to his favor. As it was before the declaration of martial law, Marcos needed the support of the military. While acting Chief of Staff General Fidel Ramos was next in line as Chief of Staff, the president knew that he needed Fabian Ver back. Ver was on leave as he was being prosecuted in the Aquino-Galman case. By December 2, 1985, Ver and 26 other suspects were acquitted in a legal decision that caused public outrage. Meanwhile, prior to the snap election announcement, a convener group was formed, composed of Loren Tanyada, Jaime V. Ongpen, and Cory Aquino to select a presidential candidate for the opposition. Cory was regarded as the rightful candidate of the people's choice. who was also promoted by Jaime Cardinal Sin. Meanwhile, Cory Aquino announced her intention to run if a snap election was to be held and if she had the support of 1 million citizens. She was successful in gaining this support. The opposition therefore had two frontrunners, Aquino and former Senator Salvador Doy Laurel. However, in the same year, on December 7, Laurel decided to give way to Aquino. Massive poll fraud and rampant cheating marred the vote of the day of the elections. February 7, 1986. Thousands of registered voters who had voted successfully in previous elections found their names suspiciously missing from the lists. COMELEC employees and computer operators at the COMELEC Tabulation Center walked out in protest due to the wide discrepancy between the computer tabulation and the tally board, showing blatant manipulation of electoral results. In the countryside, precincts were hounded by the military and ballot rigging was rampant. Namfrel in turn showed Aquino in the lead with almost 70% of the votes canvassed. By February 15, 1986, in an unprecedented announcement that was met with public outrage, the Batasang Pamansa proclaimed Marcos and Arturo Tolentino as the winners of the presidential and vice presidential race, respectively, by virtue of Resolution Number 38. Opposition assemblymen walked out of the session hall in protest. This led to the opposition's indignation rally in Luneta the next day, where Cory Aquino spoke around 2 million people in Luneta in what would be known as the Tagumpay ng Bayan rally. At the event, Aquino called for massive civil disobedience and boycott of Marcos Carney-owned companies and products. The Aquino-Laurel ticket also proclaimed victory. Coup Plot by the RAM. The Reformed Armed Forces movement emerged in 1982 as a small secret group intent on strengthening military rule through a coup d'etat. Initially, it was composed of Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile and a handful of regular officers from the Philippine Military Academy who harbored resentment against General Fabian Ber, the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. By early 1985, the RAM was a fully organized group with a leadership committee of 11 men and a membership base of around 300. Although relatively small, the RAM had the support of a majority of AAP officers, especially the PMA regulars. By the middle of the year, the RAM went public, yet popular suspicion regarding the movement's integrity arose due to its inclusion of former military torturers. Still, most media outlets ignored their human rights record, choosing instead to paint the RAM as reformers. Yet for all the RAM leaders' confidence in their plan, they did not have command experience to successfully carry out the complicated operation after almost 10 years of sitting in air-conditioned offices. And to make matters worse, Ver knew the coup. On the Thursday before the planned coup, he summoned his senior officers and engineered a trap. Faced with only two options, dispersing or regrouping, Enrile chose the latter as the more honorable option. He announced his defection from Marcos on Saturday night in a press conference at Camp Aguinaldo, alongside Lieutenant General Fidel V. Ramos, Ver's deemed successor. In the first critical hours of the uprising, RAM leaders called on former PMA classmates and comrades, pleading for support or at the very least neutrality, thus undermining Marcos' defenses. Jaime Cardinal Sin made his famous announcement over Radio Veritas, beseeching the people to bring food and gather at Camp Aguinaldo and Camp Crame to support Enrile and Ramos. An hour later, Enrile finally reached Cory Aquino via telephone. On that first night, people came to EDSA by the thousands with whatever provisions they could offer: pans of pancit, boxes of pizza, tins of biscuits, bunches of bananas. Thus began the 4-day EDSA People Power Revolution. The revolution was a peaceful one, with soldiers being coaxed with food, prayers, flowers, and cheers by people from all walks of life who stood and knelt in prayer in front of the tanks. Almost all of the military commanders were loyal to Ramos and turned against the president. On February 24 at 5 a.m. on that Monday morning, government troops headed by Marine battalions began their advance to Camp Crame, from different directions as a dozen of helicopters encircled the camp. At 6:20 a.m., the tense crowd around the constabulary headquarters waited with uncertainty as the helicopters approached. When 8 helicopters circled over Camp Crame on Monday morning, fears of bombardment were still high, but they landed and joined the rebels. This was probably the military turning point. Thereafter, military defections took place at an increasing pace. After Marcos lost complete control of the military, his presidency came to an end the following day on February 25, 1986. February 25, 1986, Corazon C. Aquino and Salvador H. Laurel took their oaths in Club Filipino as president and vice president respectively. Meanwhile, Marcos was inaugurated in the ceremonial hall of the Malacañang Palace and delivered his inaugural address in Maharlika Hall, now Kalayaan Hall, on that same day. Rocked by the key military and political defections and overwhelming popular support for Aquino, Marcos was forced to depart with his family a few hours later for exile in Hawaii, effectively ending Marcos's 2-decade-long dictatorial rule. Before we end, I will leave you all with a message in connection to our discussion. The power of the people is much stronger than the people in power. Goodbye everyone, keep safe and God bless.